Hello, welcome to Stories in Focus. I'm Eloise Schottler, your storyteller host, and if you've been here before, you know that we have special guests that we want to talk to find out what they're doing. And today we have a very special guest from Iamsville, Maryland, and her name is Susan Gordon.
Hey, Eloise.
Hey, how you doing, Susan?
Fine, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. Well, you know, we've been waiting for this for a long time. We had to get a schedule and get that all fixed up, you know. And I want to start asking you, you do something that we don't talk about too much, but you use storytelling in your work. And tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I've had this wacky master's degree in the use of storytelling in therapeutic settings. And so since 1983 or 84, I've been using a traditional story of some type or other to help pull out a client story, whether it's a child or an adult. So it's, you go across the age span.
And a client, right now you're working for Frederick County, and what is it that you're doing?
I'm an addictions counselor for Frederick County Health Department under the behavioral health group.
Right. And so how does the story help your clients speak about what their problems are?
Well, stories have beginnings, middles, and ends, which means that you can have very difficult material occurring in a story, but because it's got a structure to it, you can step in and you can step back out again. So it allows the client to say, oh, sort of run their hand across the fabric of the story and say, how's that story like my story? I have lived through that.
Right. And
then their story begins to come out much more clearly. I also use a lot of art, tell the clients, you know, Art 101 is not a requirement. Stick figures are great because art, just like story, bypasses the linear brain. And so you suddenly are drawing from a deeper place. If we were talking Freud or Jung, we'd say the unconscious.
Right. So that's really the creativity that once they tap into the creativity of the drawing or something, then you step beyond. Is that
right? And stories do the same thing too. The stories bypass sort of the linear brain and go to what's liminal, to that sort of space in between. You know, and so for instance, I can tell a story like Barney McCabe, which is a story about kids walking into a woods where there's a witch, and with a client where substance abuse is an issue, you can say, what witches have you run into? And they run into more than their share of witches, you know. And if you got into that woods, how the heck did you get out? Who was help? What was help? What did you have to remember in yourself to get out of that situation?
So that's really helping people to understand, in your situation, it's your client, but it would hold for all of life, that we are all living a story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that stories can help anybody, everybody, figure out what story they're in.
Well, that's true, and stories are the first thing we ever used. You know, stories are older than we are, older than TV, older than, you know, that's, and they usually tell the things that are deep and funny, both.
Right. Now, you're a performing storyteller. The first time I knew you was by seeing you perform. You know, so how does that work? How do you feel about that as a performer, to go from a situation where you're performing in front of a group to an intimate setting, like even performing for a single person? How do you work that out?
Well, you still have to stay in the story. You have to remember what that story is holding for you and just walk into it and just be as willing to be the characters, even if it's just one-on-one, because that listener is depending on you to carry that story. So whether it's, you know, 100 people or whether it's one, the same telling is required. You're not going to be as big when it's one-on-one, but you have to be willing to be as juicy.
Well, but you know, the other thing that occurred to me to ask you was, in that situation, is there something, because when we're up performing in front of a group of people, we don't really get a chance to understand what they're receiving when they hear the story. But you've got to hear what they're receiving in order for it to work in the therapeutic setting. Is that satisfying? How is that satisfying?
It is. Well, because the story is, you know, in an ideal setting, the story is being created between the listener and the teller, and you're reading their cues and their reaction and their laughter or their tears, and you're staying with them so that the story begins to meet them where they are. At the same time, it's got to be a place that they can meet themselves, both.
Wow. What do you do, Susan, when you're working with that and with that hope and it doesn't gel, or the client finds it too juicy or too threatening?
Well, you admit it. You know, just like you would with any place where things have gone a little awry, you say, well, that looks like that was kind of hard for you. Or do we need to stop? Do you need to back up a little bit? You know, you just have to, you know, it's all improv. You know,
right,
really.
right. But the other thing I hear is that it's all improv, but also part of what you're saying, what I was hearing from you, was that it's so important for anybody that's telling a story to watch for the clues and the cues from your audience.
Yes.
Any way that it's coming towards you, to make sure that you're attuned, whether it's 50 people and somebody says 3 people have just gone to sleep.
Right.
Obviously a problem.
Yeah, yes it is.
You know, so you have to be attuned.
Right, you do. You have to be listening to your listeners.
Right. Now you're working on a work now, a personal story that is a very difficult piece of work. I think that you're a very courageous storyteller to begin to work with this. It's called Dancing Down Darkness. Tell us about that.
Well, my daughter died in 2007, as you know, and I really couldn't do any storytelling at that point, because even I pulled back with it with my clients, because it felt like to me that the traditional tale did not hold what I needed in terms of the level of grief I was experiencing. And so I began writing. I had a very good friend who got me started writing, and I've got reams of notebooks of writing I've done about my daughter, about our family, about our animals. And I had a very good friend who said to me, I'm going to give you an hour-long performance.
Yeah.
So get that stuff off the page. And that was the proper kick in the keister, as we would say.
But now, how long were your stories not in your mouth, but you know, that you were writing? How long since you've really told them publicly?
5 years.
5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I would do an occasional story at work, but not like I was doing.
Right.
You know, I mean, it felt like a client needed a story, I'd come out with that story, but the traditional story just was not, you know, it was better to step away from them than to try and pretend my way through them.
Right, right. So in working out the story for your daughter, that's calling up a lot of personal material and everything, have you used a process of some kind? Say if somebody is watching us that would like to work with difficult material, what would you say?
Well, I think the first thing I did was just to take all the material I had and say, where's the script? Where's the storyline here? Where do we start and where do we end? And begin to get those in order. And then begin to realize very quickly I had twice the amount of material that I could use. And then to try and figure out what was most important, what would convey my daughter. I mean, she was, in the story, one of her, well, this is not just story, but in real life, one of her professors said about her that she had, was intrepid and enthusiastic. So you want that to come through in the story. So how do I build a story that shows my daughter? How do I build a story that shows ways I didn't really understand her until she was gone? You know, what learning happened as a result of this? So all of those, I started working with a young man, Adam Booth, who I think you've had here.
Yes.
And he asked me to try and draw a picture that showed the rhythm through the whole story. And because I'm an overachiever, I did a picture of each section of the story, which let us know where are ups and where are our downs. And it was that. At different points, I drew every part of the story. You know.
So you really called on yourself as an artist, which you are, as well as a storyteller writer.
Right.
Put all of that big ball of creativity to work on this story.
I did all that, and then just realizing that you're going to leave the page, that for instance, I'm doing an excerpt today. There was only 2 pages written. You know, if I was telling the whole thing, it would be about 19 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But 2 pages to 19 minutes means that you've got up and you've been willing to play in it a little bit, you know?
Exactly. This has taken a lot of time and a lot of effort. And because it's so emotional, how's it been for you to be playing in that?
Well, to be willing to cry when I need to.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
when you fall apart, fall apart. And because if you do, if you will let the rough spots happen, you'll grow from them. Or I have grown from them. So it's like, okay, I'm smacked into a really hard place. What are the lessons? And I've gotten some big lessons. You know, so I don't want to give pieces of the story away that
Of course not. You
shouldn't be.
No,
But there were huge lessons. It's like, well, I didn't even understand that
Right.
until I fell over myself in the process of finding it.
Yeah, because one of the things is that today, you know, we find that so many stories and storytellers and audiences are asking for it, are turning to almost stand-up comedy in order to be entertained, which I think is a result of television and sort of taking the juice out of storytelling. What do you think?
Well, I see a lot of that on some of the main stages. And I think sometimes it will stop a storyteller from going for the story that they're really wanting to tell. Sometimes you become formulaic when you have really a range, and we all have a range within us. But then there are storytellers who do both with just, well, I think of Kevin Kling and I think of Bill Hartley, and I think, you know, they can have you weeping 1 minute and up on your feet cheering with laughter in the next, and I think that's the best kind of storytelling.
Right, right. Because I think that your story is that it's rich with real emotion, and that I don't know, maybe it's me or other people that I've heard that have heard your story, that we're ready for that. That we need that as well as we need laughter.
Well, thank you. That's good.
Yeah, yeah, it is good. But, you know, so do you feel that in working with the material?
I've gotten a good response as I've been doing house concerts with it. You know, I'm seeing that sort of laughter to tears, you know, whatever we would call this arc, you know, that arc of both, that both are occurring, which is great, you know.
Well, now, you've said, though, that we're going to have to move on so that you can tell your story, but I want to ask you one more question. You said that you've grown through working with this difficult material, through testing yourself. Is that the basic benefit for you for having done it, or is there something else?
Well, there's an African saying, which I really trust and believe, which is that no one is truly dead as long as their story is told. You know, and when you've suddenly outlived your daughter, there's a whole community of people you want to meet her because she was such a cool person.
Right.
But you also want her remembered and alive, and for not just people who didn't meet her, but for the people who did, you know, who say, wow, she's back.
Right.
You know, so I think that's a huge impetus, you know.
So you give yourself a gift, and you give others a gift to remember her as they knew her, or to meet her.
Both.
Fresh.
Right.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Susan. And we're going to come back in a minute, and Susan is going to tell us an excerpt from Dancing Down Darkness.
The girl loved to dance. And that is the hard bottom. I mean, raise your hand in the air. Hallelujah, truth. When Liz was 10 and 11 months old, I would put on Don McLean's record. Bye, bye, Miss American Pie. Drive your Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. And Lizzie would be bouncing and swaying. When Liz was 6 and 7 years old, she built herself a whole course of kind of kid-sized jumps in the front yard, and she and her dog Mal would go galloping, dancing, prancing over every one of them. And the harder Liz's life got, the harder that girl danced. When she was 14, her pony pitched her off into a jump, nearly broke her back. And the girl was in pain from that day on. And medications and doctors and surgeries, nothing really touched it. What did that girl do with that pain? As best she could, she shucked and jived it down. There was school. School was hard for Liz from the time she was 6. In first grade, we had parent, teacher, extra counselor conferences. We had outside tutoring. And oh Lord, the testing had begun. But Liz would be 15 years old before all the varieties of dyslexia were correctly diagnosed. And by then, it was too late. That girl hated school. She had a friend, Heather. And Heather and Liz had a bet. I wonder how much school we could skip and still graduate. And one night, Heather and Liz were driving around Frederick County. They had a tape of the Grateful Dead in the car stereo. They'd turn it up, and those kids were jamming. They were just singing along, and neither one of those girls wanted to come home. So Lizzie, whoop, pulled into the Pony Club grounds. They turned up that music loud as it would go, flung open the doors, and those girls, they were out of the car, and they were just dancing, pounding the ground. Then there was the out-of-the-blue death of Liz's dad. Dead of a heart attack when he was just 53. Liz was 25, and her dad's death dropped her to her knees. She loved her dad. It was a simple, uncomplicated love. She knew her dad. He loved her beyond all bounds. Whatever she dreamed, that man was rooting her on. His death, it dropped her. But she tried not to let on. She said, "Hey, Ma, I inherited a couple things from Dad. I got his wicked sense of humor. And Mom, Dad or I, no use for authority." Oh, God, she was so right on both counts. Liz went back to Evergreen State College, Washington State, to study stream management after her dad died. But even then, when the books were shut and the girl was out of the field, she'd be out dancing. She'd be having her green hoodie on, her cargo pants, her lace-up boots, and she might be singing the song that she had written out for her dad's funeral, Grateful Dead song. Ripple on still water when no pebble has been tossed. If I knew the way, I would take you home. Liz was not a sit on the couch, contemplate your navel kind of girl. But when she was 23 years old, in community college and redoing the same basic math course again and again and again and failing it every time, in unforgiving back pain, stuck in Frederick, unable to imagine how she could ever be the person who was saving the wolves and saving the old growth forest, she decided that she would drive her truck into a tree. But she didn't do that. She came to me, she said, "Mom, I'm not thinking right." I got her to the best therapist I knew. But the most life-affirming thing that kid did was to hold a 12-hour dance marathon on our farm. That's the way that girl kicked death in the teeth. She invited 3 bands. She invited 150 people. She called all of our neighbors, and she asked them for permission. Well, they'd noticed since she was 2.5. They said, "Oh, honey, have your dance." The day of the dance arrived, and the bands were setting up inside the barn, and the barn was just vibrating with that music. Car after car pulled up the lane, but they had to get past me. I said, "I'll see your ID." And if they weren't over 21, I sent them back down the lane. Food was sat out in the kitchen. Booze was in the bathtub beside the barn door. And I thought those kids had a helium tank. But one of Liz's friends told me this year, Mrs. G, that was laughing gas. Really, I don't want to know where they got that. But explains the half an hour crazy wild giggling that started that party. Well, they drank the booze, they hid the pot, but what counted was the dancing. Those kids were out in the field, their feet were flying, body boogieing down, arms raised in the air, and I thought, what you kids dancing for? Looks like freedom, looks like life. Anything else, you're dancing it down into the ground. Well, it got dark, and those kids shucked off their sandals and their shoes, and they came into the barn, and they started dancing on dusty, turning black, bare feet. They were shoulder to shoulder. They were hip to hip. They were slamming into each other. They were moving on through. And there was Liz Gordon in the middle of them, wearing a tie-dye t-shirt, khaki shorts, bare feet, chestnut hair swinging in the air, and a grin, woohoo, Mom, across her face. 1 o'clock in the morning, and the police arrived. 3 patrol cars pulled up the lane. 3 sheriff's deputies got out and walked up to the barn. Lizzie peeled herself away from that dance and went and talked to those deputies, bold as brass. And they said, Mrs. Z called. Mrs. Z? That was a very cranky neighbor. She lived 3 farms away. We hadn't thought to call her. And then the deputy said, and Miss, this little party of yours, we can hear it from Mills on the hill. That was 2 miles away. But you know, they didn't pull anyone aside. They didn't stop the music, didn't stop the dancing. No, all 3 of those cops are standing there, arms folded across light brown uniforms, little gold trim on the shoulders. They had batons and pistols and pepper spray on their belts. But if you looked really close, you really looked, their handcuffs were swaying. All 3 of those cops, they were tapping their feet. They watched me at my post in the driveway. I stopped every car headed down, and I said, you're going to spend the night in that field. They said to Lizzie, honey, turn it down a little. They said, we're going to tell Mrs. Z, suck it up. And they left, and they never came back. And Lizzie, she kept on dancing. She danced through all the good times. She kept trying to shuck and jive her way through that pain that never let up. Pain or not, that girl was leaping in joy and dancing. That was the sword that girl used to slay hopelessness. Thank you.
Do you like this top? It's so gay. Really? Yeah, it's totally gay.
You know, you really shouldn't say that.
Say what?
Well, say that something's gay when you mean it's bad. It's insulting. What if every time something was bad, everybody said, oh, that's so girl wearing a skirt as a top?
Oh, you are.
Those are cute jeans, though. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
Hello, welcome back. Aren't you glad you stayed around to hear that story? You just don't hear that kind of or caliber of storytelling every day. Susan, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's beautiful. Beautiful story. It shows all that emotion between a mother and a daughter comes out, and it makes me want to ask you, how is it for you to tell that story?
Well, I think it makes me happy. I mean, it makes me happy because we're remembering great times. Not all, you know. I mean, her struggles with school were legion, but it mostly remembers just the joy and the kind of exuberance with which she hit life.
Well, that's what I think you were giving to us through your body movements.
Yeah.
You know, you must like music too.
I love it.
Did you and Lizzie go to music together? Did you see musicians together?
Well, we did. I mean, I think her dad and I took her to see U2 and Bono when she was in 6th grade. You know, and we were all dancing. We were all standing up there dancing. We never made the Grateful Dead shows with her. Those she did on her own. But I used to take her. There's a great open mic in Frederick on Monday nights, and we used to go listen to blues and jazz and what I call folk music, but what's called Americana right now. There wasn't any kind of music she didn't like.
Yeah. Did she play any instruments herself, or she danced, but sing or anything herself?
She was known to pick up a drum or two.
Well, that fits with her, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, yeah. Was this after she was grown, or was this when she was younger, or?
I think she probably started messing with drums. You know, I mean, she was just hand drums. You know, maybe 14, something like that.
Oh, terrific! Because that was so in that period of time, which, you know, what would that been, 80s?
Well, yeah, she was 10 in 83.
Okay, so that period of time, anybody that's listening that raised a kid or themselves was coming up during that period of time can remember how important music was. From the 70s on, music was just at the center for young people particularly, wasn't it?
Well, she loved it. I mean, a friend of hers, Carrie, said there wasn't any job in the world that Lizzie didn't think was made better by dancing and singing.
Cool, cool, cool.
She was known to do it in a lot of places that people didn't really want it, but she was there doing it anyway.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, she had what comes from you, and certainly you knew her better than anybody. The mother feels like that she does know the child totally. Such a spirited person that, you know, from the horses on, she just had spirit.
She did. Horses, dogs, friends. She was a great friend. She would tell you the truth no matter what, whether you wanted to hear it or not, and her friends absolutely loved her for it because she just was a straight shot. And she had great friends. She had a great circle of friends, and she had them from every walk of life.
That's a wonderful thing to say about somebody,
Yeah.
that they were a great friend.
Yeah.
You know, and her friends must feed that back to you.
They do. Her friend, well, you know, I only know the story about Heather and Liz driving around Frederick County and trying to figure out exactly how much school they could skip because Heather told me that. You know, I mean, and that was not a story she would have told me until Lizzie died, and she thought, oh, what the heck, she can hear it now.
So she wasn't ratting her out.
She wasn't ratting her out.
No, she wasn't ratting her out. So
no.
Heather was a good friend too.
Heather
Yeah,
was a great
right.
friend.
Now, we're going to have to go, but I am so happy to be able to tell you that Susan Gordon is going to be telling this whole story in May at Friendship Heights Village Community Center on May the 20th.
15th.
Oh, the 15th. I'm having a problem with dates. I'm having a terrible problem with dates. It's 7:30. It's free to you, and you won't ever have another finer hour of storytelling from the heart by a wonderful teller. Do come.